So the exposure triangle is basically a system for helping to understand the three different elements that affect exposure in the camera. Exposure is the gathering of light. And let's look actually at the word photography itself. So photography is from the two, I believe, Greek words, phos and graphy. Phos meaning light and graphy meaning drawing. So what we're essentially doing with a camera is drawing with light. I know this sounds a bit pretentious, but this concept is important, this idea of drawing with light, because it makes us understand that what we're actually doing to create the imagery is gathering light over a period of time, and that comes together to create an image. And the way in which we manipulate the camera also within that time, or the scene within that time, affects the outcome of the final image. So there's three ways that we can affect what we call phos, so the gathering of light in an image. There's aperture, which is the actual opening of the blades within the lens. There is shutter speed, so that's how long the curtain in front of the center stays open for gathering light. And then the final one is ISO. And ISO is how sensitive the actual sensor is to light. Now, this aspect, ISO, is purely digital, whereas the other two are mechanical. So increasing the sensor's sensitivity to light has the negative effect of bringing in noise. Now, we're going to look at that in a bit more detail a bit further on. So we need to understand each one of these different aspects of the exposure triangle. We can adapt them to the scene in front of us. At certain times, we might want to lean on one aspect of the triangle more than others. So just to confirm first, what is exposure? So exposure is literally how much light we take in. Now, correct exposure is where we have a good balance of light and darkness. So what cameras have to do that our brains also do that we're not aware of is adapt to continually differing amounts of light. So obviously at nighttime, we just know it's darker. And that's because our eyes can't see that well in the dark. They're not that well evolved. But in the daytime, we're constantly adapting to the amount of available light in a situation. We might know empirically that a room is darker than outside, but actually our eyes are constantly adapting to make it so that the exposure of each one of those two environments is roughly the same. And understanding the exposure triangle enables us to make the camera adapt to the different environments and ensuring that we capture a consistently good exposure. So each one of these elements of the exposure triangle works in what we call stops. And a stop is basically an amount of light that the camera gathers. So the benefit of this system is that if I want to increase my aperture, knowing that that's going to add an extra stop of light, I can then adapt my shutter speed by one stop to ensure that the exposure remains the same. And these stops in a camera will work in increments of 1/3. So let's look at those specific aspects now of the exposure triangle in more detail. So the first one we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically how long the camera shutter is open for. So if you imagine the sensor of the camera to be on the stage of a theatre, and there's a light where the audience would normally be sitting. So we can open the curtains of the stage for a second. So we open curtains, close curtains. And that 1 second is how long that the sensor on the stage has been gathering light for. Now we can manipulate the shutter speed to be faster or slower. And the quicker it is, the less light that it gathers, and the slower it is, the more light that it gathers. So where there are scenes with differing amounts of light, we can adapt the shutter speed to make sure that we gather the correct amount of light for our exposure. So imagine we're shooting, holding the camera, and there's not a lot of light around. So we want to decrease the shutter speed so that we may be exposing for a second. Now, there's two problems with doing this. First problem is that if I wobble at all in the time that the camera is gathering light, where the camera was at the start, it was gathering light from here, and where the camera has moved, it's now gathering light from over here. And that causes what we call motion blur. Now, that's one of two ways that we can create motion blur. The second way that we can create motion blur is through even where the camera is held perfectly still and steady, potentially on a tripod, things in the scene move. So if we have someone walking through the scene and we have someone walking through the scene where we've had the curtain open at the start and then close at the end, where that person's moved across the scene in that time, they're going to leave a ghost. So So in this scenario, what we might want to do is take in light from other areas of the exposure triangle so we can get the shutter speed that we want. And then there's one other rule that I would just like to quickly go over. If you're shooting handheld and you don't want any motion blur from moving the camera, it's always good to shoot a shutter speed that is twice the focal length of your lens. Now, this might be a little bit technical, but we're going to discuss focal lengths of lenses a bit further on. So the next aspect of the exposure triangle we're going to look at is aperture. So aperture is literally the blades on the inside of the lens and how wide those blades open up to gather light. So if you think of it like your pupil, we know that in a darker room, our pupil dilates, expands, and takes in more light. You can literally see this if you stand in front of a mirror and you shine a light in your eye. Now the camera is doing the same thing. So if we open up the aperture blades so to their widest point, what happens is we reduce something called our depth of field. And our depth of field is essentially the section of an image away from the camera that is sharp, our focal point. And if we shut down the aperture, making it smaller, we'll expand that depth of field. Now, for a few other reasons that we're not going to get into because they're quite technical, it's always ideal to shoot in the middle of your lens's aperture range, written on the lens itself, to make sure that the focal point is at its sharpest. So the final aspect of the exposure triangle that we're going to look at is ISO. ISO is how sensitive the camera sensor is to gathering light. The camera sensor is a semiconductor that we can actually see in the camera if you take off the lens that's sensitive to light. And this is actually where the image is formed. So what's different about ISO than the other two is that it's entirely digital. And what we learn about the other two is there's certain trade-offs when we increase or decrease the amount of light that those two things gather. The shutter speed adds in or cuts down on motion blur, and with aperture, it increases or decreases the depth of field. Now, the cost of increasing sensitivity to light with ISO is that it increases the level of noise. Now, you might be thinking, what's noise? Well, if you think about it like this, if you take a song and you play it through your speakers, now, at the middle of the speaker's range, at the middle volume, everything will be quite clear. But if we keep increasing the volume all the way up to the top of the speaker's range, what happens is there's lots of distortion, lots of noise. It starts to sound quite muddy and unclear. And that's because we've increased the signal of the speakers. And as a result, we've increased the noise. And that noise is basically just pieces of data that get mixed in with the actual data that we want that sort of cloud the image. So if you imagine when you're imagine you're listening to the radio in the car and you tune in just slightly to the wrong radio, what you'll get is lots of noise. And that's essentially where the antenna of the car is picking up a lot of noise. So final thing to say about ISO is that our preference generally is to shoot in what we call the native ISO. Now, for my camera, the native ISO is 100. I think for certain others it's 160, but you can just Google that and find out for your camera what the native ISO is. And if you shoot at that rate, you will get almost no noise at all. So let's recap the exposure triangle. So the exposure triangle is a way to understand how we can balance the three light gathering techniques in a camera. Faster shutter speed means less light but freezes motion. Slower shutter speed means more light, but things in motion either in the camera or in the scene will cause blur within the image. Aperture is the extent to which the blades of the camera open. A wider aperture means more depth of field and the camera gathers more light. And a tighter aperture means the camera gathers less light and has a deeper depth of field. And finally, ISO. ISO is how sensitive the camera sensor is to light. The more we increase the ISO, the more we increase noise in our image.